Hello, you are watching Procurement and Supply Chain Live. And this next session features Supriya Iyer from Google Global Networking. Supriya leads Google's global networking supply chain with a focus on predictable materials, supply and operations to build and run the network at scale. She's a business leader with 20 plus years of experience in transforming value chains and growing small teams into mature organizations that are poised to deliver high quality products and services. Supriya enjoys fast-paced, dynamic environments and has loads of experience in balancing this with fostering a people-first culture and stakeholder engagement. Previously, she's held global leadership positions at the likes of VMware, General Electric and ICI, and she embraces the values of integrity, inclusion, and belonging, and leading with empathy. So welcome to the show, Supriya.
Thank you, Scott. Hello, everyone. It's always a pleasure to meet like-minded people who are in procurement, supply chain, and very, very passionate about this field. Today, I would like to talk to you about Google's network, the world's largest network, and what is supply chain for Google networking looks like. How does it work? And what the last 2 years have been. I know it has been challenging for all of us. So this is my perspective or view of the world from the Google supply chain team that supports the world's largest network. So without further ado, let me talk to you about what does Google's network look like. So if we move to the next slide, what you see is, so when Google initially built a network, they built it for Google search, they built it for Google apps, right? But when they found that they have built one of the highest capacity kind of network, it was like, well, why don't we share it with the rest of the world? Why don't we support enterprise customers? So when you watch your cat video, like I always say, or any other, your child does some learning online, you're most likely using what we call Google's production network. This network and data center infrastructure is built to deliver services to Google's users and Google's customers. Then there is also a network that we use to serve productivity tools for Google or Alphabet employees. And this is where they use their Gmail, they use YouTube, but they use all of their productivity tools. Over time, what we are seeing is a convergence of these two networks. So there's no longer, the lines are getting blurred between what is an enterprise network and what's a production network, because we are having to now build at scale. We are having to deploy at scale, and we have excess capacity sometimes on one network versus the other. So the worlds are blending, the designs are becoming more scalable and modular, and all of this is also leading to a more autonomous network. A network that builds itself, repairs itself, and I wish it supplied materials to itself, but that's where supply chain exists. Moving on to the next slide. The reason I wanted to put this up is basically to share like, what is the network? When we talk about network, you've all heard of data centers. So, right, so there's a certain perception on what a data center is. Is this huge building with cooling, a lot of kind of racks, a lot of with line cards and cables. Yep, that world is correct. But when we talk about data centers, we need to still connect one data center to another. And from those data centers, how do you connect to the internet service providers? So users such as you and me, doctors, students, all of us have access to the internet. So Google's network, in a very simple way, consists of a system of high capacity fiber optic cables that encircle the globe. And this is similar to any other big network provider, networking services provider. And Google's network is both under the land and sea. So this is where we get a lot of very interesting questions. Do the sharks bite the fiber optic cables? Yeah, well, they sure try. And we have to protect them with Kevlar so that, you still get your internet services without interruption. This number, I'm going to throw some stats at you, but these numbers change on a daily basis, so to speak. Globally, right now, Google has about 16 data centers. with 5 more coming online very, very soon, 24 cloud regions. So these are regions where we say, hey, here is where big presence is there, big investment is there, and 73 zones. Again, these regions are divided into kind of zones. 134 points of presence. So POP sites are those which kind of, again, improve your connectivity, and they supplement what you have with the data centers and your kind of big investments in terms of the regions and the zones. And 14 subsea cables that traverse the globe under the sea, and they are in partnership with some of the big governments, some of the big telcos. So that's how complex this world is. And it helps to understand a little bit of that, because you can see then the complexity of supplying materials, supplying labor, pursuing all the contracts. How does that really look like in this world? Moving on to the next slide. When you talk about this, even with all of this kind of infrastructure, you also need something on what is called the edge, the network edge. So we have 3,000 plus network edge locations in 200 plus countries and territories to offer best low latency services to users and customers. And because people use videos, gaming, Stadia cloud gaming, rich content that comes through YouTube, Google Photos, Google Assistant, you don't want to ask a question and keep waiting. At least I don't. So that is where these edge locations that come. So the network, again, is not in isolation. It is a web, and it has got a scale, from data centers to zones, to cloud regions, to POP sites, to kind of edge network that brings it all together. And the way this is built in this manner is so that it can also be scaled. So what does it look like? What does the supply chain team look like that kind of supports this network? So if we jump on to the next slide, I can talk to you about how my team, the supply chain team, is structured. So the supply chain team basically looks at this forward supply chain and the reverse supply chain. And I'll explain that. That won't be any different to what you have in your kind of industries as well. So the product life cycle and the transitions with OEM, original equipment manufacturer gear, vendor gear, what our engineering changes are made. The whole transition and life cycle management is managed by the product life cycle team. The asset management team is also part of it. So what they do is the launch and the turning on of assets, because remember, it's across 200 countries, different parts of the world, remote location, in some farmer's field, under the sea. So knowing what are our assets, turning them on, and then turning them down, right? So that is part of what the PLM and AM team do. And supply chain resiliency. If the last 2 years have taught us anything, it is about how do we build resiliency as core part of running supply chain, right? And when a lot of your gear is also vendor gear, how do you delve those levels, few levels deeper? Over the last 20 plus or even more years, there has been an investment to go to more lower cost locations. And we have thought the world is local in the sense that you can manufacture somewhere, ship somewhere. But now we also understand the need for some more closer locations and to have more control of your logistics and supply chain. So supply chain resiliency looks at that. A big part of my team is also commercial operations. What this team does, I talked to you about the subsea cables, I talked to you about the contracts. These are all different buildings all over the world. The utility services for that, the contracts to do the partnerships, all of those, the payments, so the whole invoice to payment cycle, the contract to pay to kind of invoice to kind of the final circling back and renewals. All of that is managed by the team that we call Netco. And this team does this not just for Google, but this does it for all of Alphabet. Solution architecture. One other thing is, if we want to build scale and velocity, we need to be investing in our capabilities, whether it be process, data, systems capability, and not just within supply chain, within the boundaries of supply chain, but across the value chain, which includes our partners, our suppliers, our customers, so that there is full transparency, there is real time data, and we can take the best decisions. At more operational level, supply operations is the team that ensures that once the materials are in the warehouse, how do we get them to the points of presence or POP sites or the final destination? And remember, often these are unmanned sites, and you can't just leave the product. So there is all of those complexity around last mile delivery, ensuring you don't deliver too soon, ensuring that you don't deliver too late. You're there when the tech is dropped off so that the work or the installation work can be also done. And supply planning. So, the amount of effort you put in planning makes it easier for rest of not just supply chain, but the value chain to work. So the supply planning team basically looks at forecasting, ingesting the demand, working with our partners, our key vendors, ensuring they understand our demand, placing those purchase orders, the expediting, de-expediting. So fairly traditional supply planning work. Where the wrinkle comes here is that we are getting into many more complex countries as part of geo expansion. The import export laws in those countries, the security requirements in those countries. You're working with those governments in those countries. So that brings a certain level of uniqueness to each of those geo expansion projects. It also brings a lot of complexity and a lot of influencing and wrangling within Google to kind of make projects kind of move forward. With all of this team doesn't just look at the forward supply chain, we look at the reverse supply chain. So there are two key components of reverse supply chain. One is the repairs. What if somewhere remotely something breaks down? How do you repair the network? What do you carry in your spoke so that you can turn around, repair, provide the parts, get it done? And how do you then work with service contracts and warranties with your vendors? The other part is decommissioning. We're constantly in the world of technology moving to next gen equipment, which means that at some stage, the previous generation or the current gen is decommissioned. So that again needs to be collected from all of these remote locations, brought back, cleansed of all the data. We're all very particular about privacy, ensuring we do everything the right way. And then we have to dispose that. Either we reuse it, we remarket it, or we kind of scrap it. So this is the whole life cycle of how networking supply chain works. I think there would be quite a few parallels to how your worlds work as well in the matter of supply chain. But there is this need for velocity, there is this need for scale, there is this need to actively kind of invest in technology. And as the network becomes more autonomous, how can the supply chain supplying this network become more real time and autonomous? So those were the challenges even before the pandemic that were in front of us. Next slide, please. So if I have to talk about the story of the perfect storm, these are 5-year plans, the plans of men and mice, but, we had planned to go live with our ERP, which we did towards kind of late 2020. Right. And whenever we go, it went through fairly smoothly, which was kind of amazing. But it also then exposed data process vulnerabilities. The interfaces with our vendors, they all needed to be reset. So there were already operational issues and delays that got introduced into the system that we were starting to burn down all of those bugs and issues. What today does not need silicon chips, right? But with the network, they're very, very custom silicon chips. And a lot of that manufacturing has been concentrated in a particular geography, which means that there is no other way. There are single points of failure. And with the pandemic, it truly exposed the vulnerabilities of the end-to-end supply chain. So what our vendors had with their vendors, they had vendor managed inventory, they had inventory in the pipe in terms of sub assemblies, raw material. All of that started getting depleted very, very quickly. While that was happening, our demand started soaring as more and more people, industries, schools, students, medical staff all started working remotely or relying more on the network for information and the ability to do their work. So the demand for the network was growing at 3x, 4x what it already does, while the supply was dwindling rapidly. So this was, well, that's why I call it the perfect storm. While this also happened, I mean, just as an aside, because this is all about discussion of how life kind of, happens, I had to undergo kind of three surgeries. So when you look at, man, what was it? It was 2020, 21 was like, could anything else really break? Could anything else really happen around us? And the answer for this was no. But thankfully, having experienced supply chain people, people who have the mindset to move in an agile manner and start to solve problems, thanks to those trusted partnerships, we started to make some roadway and get some gains. So let's talk about that a little bit and let's see if that kind of resonates with you. So moving on to the next slide. So we had to think about response, and the response is urgently what did we need to do. So Supriya has to go and get surgery, she has to sort that out, but in at work, what do we need to do immediately? Short term, medium term, and start laying down the tracks for the long term. So actively demand shaping. The demand was growing, supply was dwindling. So I think all of us within supply chain have been working with our internal, external customer teams to do actively demand shaping and ensure those critical P0 programs or projects are not getting delayed. Increasing predictability, working very, very closely with our key vendors and partners in that partnership model, and signing up and providing that long-term forecast and long-term agreements to say, please, we will take those kind of materials, we will make that investment. Please, you go ahead in time and do those with your kind of supply chain. Enhancing that market intelligence to kind of look and say, what is coming up end of sale? Typically in the networking world, quite a few parallels you would see in any of the technology fields is 2-3 year horizon at a minimum for end of sale. So getting ahead of it, understanding it, managing those very, very closely became very key. And then we looked at saying, hey, how can we have some targeted sourcing strategies so we move our kind of supply closer to the geographies where they are needed? Instead of constantly moving equipment from APAC to Europe, from Europe to North America, and then Latin America, what can we do to kind of move the supply closer to where we need it? So all of this is driving the right behaviors where even without a pandemic, even without the port congestion, even without all of those issues, we need to be constantly thinking and also engaging with the governments and the bodies within our countries and regions where we work to make that adequate investment in manufacturing locally. With all of this, there was a lot of frustration within the Google networking team, like the project managers who actually installed the network. For them, it was like, wow, there's so much demand. I have the people ready to go. I don't have materials. So at this time, we kind of put the power back in their hands through launching an e-commerce portal where they could get locally, whether it be in Ukraine, whether it be in Russia, whether it be in China, whether it be in Saudi Arabia, they could locally get at least the passive. So they are not waiting for, power cables. They are not waiting for passive equipment for that to get shipped. We kind of made that easily accessible. We also standardized. So we had a long tail of passive equipment, thousands and thousands. We started to standardize it again and to reduce it. We go through that exercise regularly. It had blown out again. We brought back, standardized it, which also helped us to standardize the vendors, which meant that you could now give more volume to a smaller group and you could stay very close with these vendors and partners. And then it became about how do you improve fungibility. So we work with a lot of optics, right? So with optics, there are the OEM optics. There's also what we call third-party optics. So how do you improve fungibility by qualifying at a rapid rate the third-party optics so they can serve? So now you're increasing your supply funnel by not just relying on certain specific optics. Again, removing non-critical. These are like fundamentals, but this is what I talk about now, viewing the world through a microscope and looking at bill of one BOM versus another BOM, what is critical to deployment, what is not critical to deployment, and removing those. Now we are taking these kind of lessons and making sure that all the BOMs moving forward do not have any non-critical item that a particular project manager has thought it would be nice to have, because that was what was gating that order from getting released. So some of these kind of on the ground, knowing your customer's pain, supporting them to solve for those problems. And forecasting and networking hasn't ever been great, because think of a customer like a Spotify, could be a TikTok, could be any customer like a Target that runs massive retail. They are growing rapidly, so they are not always able to indicate their compute or storage demand to us, which means it's hard for us to know, always predict or provide a forecast. But getting a lot granular and saying this is what we can do and providing more stable forecast to our suppliers was a promise we made, and we're trying to keep up with that. And kind of control the growth from that perspective a little bit, like balanced growth, stable growth. All of these kind of things, as we are learning, we started converting that into what does it mean in terms of ongoing operational excellence. I talked about the supplier consolidation. We started also harvesting our own network. I talked before about the reverse supply chain, decommissioning equipment. So we started to put a red tag. So for many of you who have read the book Goal, you know how it works. You put these are critical components. So even with our reverse supply chain, as equipment was getting decommissioned and we started using smart hands instead of actual people because they couldn't go to sites because of the pandemic, but then bringing back that critical equipment quickly so that we could reuse it. So that became our own source of supply chain. Similarly, working with our vendors and sourcing gray market equipment, then certifying it, testing it, again, created another alternate kind of supply chain. And then we started also getting in-region kind of supplier for some generic equipment so that, again, for those, we are not reliant on one part of the world. And with all of these things, moving parts, and I've heard a lot of others in supply chain talk about this, we also did the same. We learned from the best and we established a control tower cadence where the key people stand up meeting every day, what's top of mind, what needs to get resolved, and bringing data in. And over time, this has become a lot robust. So did any of these kind of yield some results? Did we make forward movement? So let me talk about what were the outcomes. So moving on to the next slide. In Q1, by Q1 22, we reduced basically the hardware and the optical kind of dependencies or shortages to pre-pandemic levels. Doesn't mean it's zero, but it was drastically kind of reduced with all of this investment in the steps. We enabled local procurement. We achieved improved order to delivery performance to 95% of target, which meant the network stayed up and everybody could do their work remotely. We supported 100% of urgent and unforecasted cloud demand. And many of us won't even know it, but when you use something, you're at the background, the network is running. Only when it fails, I think people recognize. So that was good. And again, end of sale, that process started kind of building, even strengthening the partnership with our vendor teams. This exercise actually helped us to build much closer relationships with our internal functions, right? Even in engineering, first it was maybe there was more clearer boundaries, but with all of this crisis, it has taught us to build really strong relationships with the internal Google teams, whether it be the software teams, the engineering hardware teams, and all of this has actually led us to even improve lead times. And here I'm talking to you today. So, I came out of those three surgeries as well, safe and sound. Uh, the last, like, I'll just take a minute to say, all of these things make you reflect, right? And there are some of those lessons. So, just the next slide. What did we learn? Things will fail, right? So nothing new here. I mean, this is not something new that I'm sharing with you, but this is what I'm left with as I reflect on the last 2 years. Things will fail, bodies will fail, things will go wrong. Expect it, manage it. So invest in resiliency and invest in upfront, not when the crisis hits. Ruthlessly prioritize. Everybody wants everything. You need to have that framework, prioritize, and stand by it, right? Invest in trusted partnerships. I talked a lot about it in the examples. If we had not done that internally within the other Google functions, but also with our vendors, those trusted partnerships have stood us in good stead. They have provided the market intelligence and helped us to make business savvy decisions. It has put supply chain team, given a bit more front and center seat at the leadership table and helped to shape those timely decisions for Google. Be vulnerable, honest, and courageous, right? Whether it be your own health, whether it is your team's well being, whether it is errors made, whether it's bad processes, acknowledging, investing, building those connections. When you're building them with your internal partners or with vendors, don't forget your own team. People went through an extremely tough time personally, having your kids do remote learning, worrying about the health and well-being of families all around the world. Um, this was definitely a moment for good, authentic leadership to shine, and also investing in people. Without the high caliber of people, without the people who cared, this would not have been possible for us to achieve 95% of target during one of the world's largest kind of crisis and come out growing and holding steady. Um, so, I mean, from as a leader leading the supply chain, first of all, I'm filled with gratitude for the partners, for the support from Google's leadership, but also from our suppliers who worked as one value chain. And thank you for the opportunity to share this with you today. And I look forward to any questions, any thoughts, any sage advice that you can share with me on what you have done differently in your supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Supriya. Really interesting insights into your views on leadership and supply chain and some of the issues that you've been facing as well. Now, let's try and end on a positive note. Do you think the worst is over for supply issues and are things getting better?
I think, at least in the space that I'm in, Scott, I think this is going to continue. It is becoming more stable, but I think it will be 24 where we can say 2024 where we can say we're coming out of it. To the lesson from this beyond, even 23 and 24 for us is going to be making that active investment and in manufacturing a little more within region, locally, driving all of that kind of mindset, which will kind of open up the supply pipeline for the future.
Okay, and we've only got a minute left, but a quick question I have for you here. You mentioned there at one stage there was a sense of frustration in the networking team, and you also highlighted how you addressed that. And that reminded me of the current talent shortage, which is affecting, globalization, global organizations, sorry. Does it even affect a company as renowned and respected as Google?
Absolutely, it does, Scott. I mean, yes, people do want to be part of Google, but there is a toll. This kind of extended work hours that everybody in supply chain has been facing has taken on people, right? When you're working remotely. And that is where my point, the lesson learned was to be vulnerable, not just disappear, acknowledge, tell people what you're going through, create that environment. And I'm very, very thankful to be working at Google, where it's a learning organization and there's active investment. So we have managed to retain majority of our workforce. We have managed to hire and bring in good talent remotely. So this is why having an infrastructure, having that investment in people all through is very important. And it really shows up when you have a crisis like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, that's all we've got time for now, Supriya, but thank you so much for your insights and your session today.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to all of you. Thanks, Scott. Thank you.
And for more great sessions, stay tuned. We'll be right back.